Hello, and nice to see you again. Sorry about the problems yesterday. I record these on my phone and I ran into some device issues that I couldn't solve. This week's topic is coverage of education, and I think I feel more strongly than most weeks that I wish we were doing this together because when it comes to education and thinking about education issues, I see you, the students, as the experts. You experience education and its issues every day. You've been doing it in most cases for many years in a row. And so you certainly have a hands on insider's view of some of the things that I will touch upon today. And I wish I could hear your thoughts directly and have a conversation about this. Generally speaking, I think that news coverage of education is fairly good, not across the board, maybe less so on the major internet news sites, but in magazines, both print and online, and in the major newspapers. I think there's a lot of pretty good coverage across the whole range from pre K to graduate school. And I just want to go through uh, some of the key issues that I think you should think about and look for coverage of and different points of view. One of the important things to keep in mind is that living and working in the New York City area, we're dealing with an educational environment like none other, or at least none other in the United States. The public school system has 1.1 million students in it. The Department of Education tries to develop policies and programs and standards that cover all of them while at the same time acknowledging there's a lot of diversity of cultures and diversity of needs within that system. And one of the perennial issues is how do you administer such a large citywide system and still account for neighborhood needs and neighborhood voices? How do you engage the children? How do you engage the families in their decisions made about their education? I think this is true of most large cities, and from what I know of most large cities around the world. But I think in New York, that's the system we know best. The problem is particularly striking and staggering. Um, though I must say, I'm not aware of another major American city uh, that does it better, or doesn't have the same issues and challenges, though usually on a smaller scale. When we start at um, the early grades, I think we should acknowledge that one of Mayor de Blasio's innovations was start kindergarten at age 4 and then at age 3. And that I think that that's widely regarded as a success. There's some data that shows that students who get this early start do better, and it also, from an earlier age, relieves some pressure on the families and allows them more time to work or to take care of domestic chores. Uh, so, why hasn't it been universally adopted? And the answer is usually money. Um, Funding for public education is sometimes precarious. Often, a city unit is dependent on money coming above from the state legislature, and there may be a disconnect in the political environment. A Democratic city with a Republican state government, or vice versa. So that can sometimes be very hard to arrange. Um, and that money is a crucial issue all through education in terms of the variety of curriculum, the variety of books, the school meals that can be served. And all of this can be good fodder for journalists looking for coverage. There was an interesting situation in New York City about 10 years ago where some professional chefs and cooks were brought in to see if they could do something to improve the food and make it more attractive to students. And One of the very simple things they found was that rather than putting apples on tables or carrots on tables, if you put out slices of apples or slices of carrots, the children were much, much more likely to eat them. So that seemed like a very simple breakthrough, but the Department of Education then discovered it was considerably more expensive to have to take the apples, slice them up, bag them, or put them in bowls rather than just sticking them out on the tables. And this was a program that foundered for a while simply because it didn't have funding. So even simple things like that come into play. A major issue around the country and a very good source of journalism stories is the contrast between wealthy school districts and poorer ones. Some states have tried to address this on a statewide basis. Vermont passed a law years ago that was known locally as the Robin Hood Law, in that it took money from the wealthy school districts and redistributed it to the poorer school districts. And many people thought this was a great idea. And some of the wealthier people deeply resented it. Some of them even left the state. But we see that sort of income disparity in New York City a great deal, where the funding, the official government funding, may not vary so much, but the level of voluntarism and parental engagement varies enormously. And in some of the wealthier school districts, parents donate funds that provide arts programs or that sustain sports programs. They underwrite school trips. They have guest speaker programs. They have screenings of films and other productions. They make sure there's a rich supply of art supplies, for example. And the poorer schools simply don't have those assets, and their children suffer. And these are sort of societal issues in terms of your view of education and what a priority it should be and how important it is and how you fund it. Another highly charged issue for a number of years has been the rise of charter schools and whether they provide better education and whether they suck resources away from the rest of the public school system. There are very strong voices on both sides of this argument. There are studies that show charter schools outperform public schools in some cases, and there are studies that show they do not outperform public schools in some cases. Charter schools generally pay their teachers less, require them to work longer hours, and also to some extent have the freedom, the liberty to cherry pick the good students and ignore the bad ones. And that sort of it changes the balance of needy students within the public school system if the better students are drained and the less good students are left behind. So that's one of the issues. The proponents of charter schools talk about freedom of choice. School choice is sort of their motto. Why shouldn't families have the right to choose the best schools for their children? And on the other side of the argument, and I should note that a lot of the billionaires who have donated a great deal of money to education and what they like to call education reform are strong advocates of this type of education. The other side of the argument, I think, would be from people like me who feel that public school is one of the glues, one of the fundamental glues that holds society together. In a very broad sense, you're exposing children to one another, to people of different backgrounds and different communities. You all go through more or less the same experience, and it's part of becoming an engaged member of our society. I think that there's been a great deal of coverage of this issue. They've played out around the country. My colleague, Professor Andrea Gabor, has written a book her most recent book is called After the Education Wars, that looks at this issue very closely. And one of the places she looks at is New Orleans. And after the terrible devastation of Hurricane Katrina, New Orleans more or less turned over its entire public school system to charter school operations. And Gabor assesses that and feels that it has not been a good thing. I should mention also that in the Blackboard folder for this week, there is a 12-minute video interview that Professor Gabor did about education that I think is well worth your time. Part of the broad debate often focuses around teachers' unions and the strength they carry in some parts of the country. Where the unions are common and strong, and New York is one of them, they carry enormous weight. They vote. They often vote as a bloc. Politicians and policymakers fear them. And, well, I'm a pro-union person. I think unions are a good thing, but I also feel like unions can get a bit out of control. And they fight for what teachers think is important, and they fight for what they think is important for children and families within the context of their own needs. I think they're a force for good. Many people think they're a great obstacle to education reform and innovation. I remember a number of years ago, I was running workshops for some German journalists, and we were down in Washington interviewing and meeting different policymakers. And one of the people we went to see was Senator Richard Shelby of Alabama, who's still in the Senate, one of the older, more powerful members. I think he's the head of the Senate Armed Forces Committee. And one of the journalists said to him, of the 50 states, Alabama ranks 49th in education quality. And how do you feel about that, and what's the problem? And Shelby said, the problem is the teachers' union. If there was no teachers' union, there would be no educational problems in Alabama. Now, you can make what you want of that, but I mention that just because that strong point of view is still fairly common. We've had a lot of flare-ups in the last couple of years before the pandemic of teachers going on strike in West Virginia, in Arizona, and in parts of Texas, seeking better wages. In many parts of the country, teachers are severely underpaid. They make less money than, say, garbage men. And this is not to denigrate garbage men in any way, but if you're trusting your child's education to people, wouldn't you want to attract the best teachers that you could? And that's hard to do if you don't pay a good wage. So these are all issues that you should think about, issues that you should read news coverage of. Each time there's a teacher strike, you should monitor that coverage wherever it is in the country and see what the different points of view are, what the arguments are, and ultimately what the resolution is. I think that that is one of the key struggles in education, and particularly public education, K through 12. It's less of an issue at the college level, where CUNY actually has a fairly strong union, the Professional Staff Congress, PSC, but that is unusual. So just to go back to the early grades, some of the issues that have come up around the country and that have come up locally are, what should be in the curriculum, how important are foreign language skills. I think there's a broad agreement that skill in mathematics, in arithmetic, and in language arts, reading and writing, are very important. but what else do you add into the mix? How important is history, and what history do you teach? Do you teach American history? Do you teach global history? From what perspective do you teach it? What do you leave in, and what do you leave out? What books do you choose as the textbooks for your courses? All of these are very important issues, and one of the things that we have seen in states that have become more conservative is they start altering the curriculum and altering textbook choice and sort of changing the universe of what their children are learning. And this has come up around theories of evolution. It's come up around global warming and climate change, and are students getting a good education about what's going on? Are they presented facts so eventually they can make their own decisions, or are they just being presented highly charged opinion or commentary of one side or the other? And you can look at specific issues and how they play out, whether it's criminal justice, income inequality, nutrition, healthcare, all of these issues, and see how they play out in specific schools and specific communities, and what's important and what isn't. Another thing that you should be aware of on the K through 12 level is, and this is an issue that's largely invisible in New York City, but in most of the United States, the principal funding for school systems comes from property taxes on individual properties. We don't see this so much in New York because we're a city of renters, and renters do not pay property tax. It's the landlords who pay the tax. But where you go to home-owning communities, and of course there are some in New York, but very commonly in the suburbs and all over the country, there's a very direct tie between the amount of property taxes you pay and your local school budget. And so one result of that is that residents of those communities are much more aware of educational policy. If the local school system decides it wants to add language instruction in, let's say, Chinese or Arabic, and that probably means hiring a new teacher. Do you bring in a full-time teacher and offer a number of courses? Do you just bring somebody in as an adjunct to teach one course? Can you share, let's say, a Chinese language instructor with neighboring school systems and share the cost? That might sound logical, but it's not so easily done because different districts have different policies. But you will find parents thinking about these issues, talking to one another, attending school board meetings, and very engaged. Like, how important are the arts? Should students be required to learn to play an instrument? If so, does the school provide the instrument? Does the student get to choose the instrument? And then the school is obligated to provide it. How does that work? All of this plays out. Just in the little village where I live, the school board decided it needed to put a new roof on the school, on the elementary school. And no one could really argue with that, even though it cost millions of dollars. But then they said, well, they wanted to build a second story on part of the school because it would give them more flexibility, and the multi-purpose room could become a dedicated cafeteria and also have a dedicated student activity area. And it was a matter of great debate, and there were school board meetings and arguments, and just that level of engagement in decisions that the school board makes is very common throughout the United States, and maybe much less so in New York City, but you should be aware of it. And even in the metro area, if you wound up being a journalist in New Jersey or parts of New York, anywhere north of New York City, out on Long Island, you will see that interplay between the taxpayer base the local boards of education and educational policy. So it's good to have an understanding of that. It's good to be able to read a school board budget and to be able to ask questions of the school administrators, of educational experts, and the parents, and try to get a real sense of what the families are looking for. Do they expect a school to provide organized sports, or do they look to outside community organizations like Little League to provide the sports? These are hotly debated issues, and they can make for some very good stories. Another very important issue in education, and I think this receives a fair amount of coverage, is there's a nationwide shortage of teachers. And there are a couple of reasons for this. One is that there was a huge wave of retirements. Another is that the wages are so low in some places that they do not attract talented young people. And within the wage systems, there's not a high ceiling. If you're hired for, say, $35,000 or $40,000, as you might be in Arizona, after 20 years, you might be making $55,000, and that's not very attractive to many young people who are thinking about the future and being able to support their own families. So there's a problem attracting people, there's a problem losing people, and there's also a dismaying amount of turnover. There's national data that shows about a third of new teachers give up and leave teaching within 3 years. They find it too stressful, they don't find it satisfying. When you start out, you think, well, this doesn't sound so bad. I have 12 weeks off every year. I get all the holidays off. The school day ends at 3. But they find that they're overwhelmed by dealing with lots of needy children, lots of needy families, lack of infrastructure, way too much to do in planning, in evaluating student work. And so when you have this constant churn, it's very destabilizing. It's destabilizing for families that want to get to know the teachers in the school. It's destabilizing for administrators who have to keep recruiting and training and integrating people into their staffs, only to lose some of them very quickly. So that's something to be aware of as well. I think that another very big issue in education is testing and assessment. And how important is it? How do you do it fairly? How do you come up with tests that do not discriminate on the basis of children's background and culture? How valuable are the assessments? In most states, there are statewide exams. This is probably a good place just to say, of course, this year, everything has been crazy because of the pandemic and its disruption, and a lot of the exams scheduled for last spring were canceled. No one's exactly clear what's going to happen this year, but how well the tests reflect student experience, how well they are predictors of student success, is constantly being debated and remains an unsettled issue. I think that there are areas where school systems are moving away from standardized teaching. I think one of the problems or one of the issues is the state legislators who authorize school budgets like the testing because it gives them something quantifiable that they can look at and compare. But one of the unfortunate dynamics this creates is what's called teaching to test, where teachers, rather than trying to develop students' imaginations and creativity and encourage them to think critically, just become obsessed with preparing students to take the exams and drilling them in exam taking almost from day one. And there again here, there have been a lot of studies that show, that this is very destructive to student creativity. But this is another issue that if you're interested in education, you will come upon. I think, let me just turn my attention for a minute to some of the issues in college, where I guess perhaps your expertise is greatest. Some of the national issues that also play out in New York is there is great concern with how many students enroll in college and never complete it. And one of the one of the criteria that people look at is what is called progress towards a degree. And how long does it take for a student from the time she first enrolls in college to earn her degree? And the national average of all students attending college is somewhere around 6 years. At Baruch and most of CUNY, it is lower than that. But this causes great concern both among the students and their families, but also among legislators who are financing this. And why does it take so long to get a degree? Well, there are lots of reasons, as you know. Sometimes students change their minds and are not sure what they want to study and change their majors. I know I did twice, and you need to tack on an extra semester. Sometimes students' circumstances change. They need to stop school or cut back to part-time study to work and earn money to continue their education. Most students are part of family units. Sometimes the family circumstances change. A family has to move, they have to get a new job, or they lose a job and their circumstances change, or someone becomes ill and the students are needed for tasks at home or care. But a big problem, and I think this is less a problem in CUNY than some of the other massive public university systems like California and Texas, is sometimes students take a long time to graduate because they cannot get into the required courses they need. And some of the, CUNY is very large taken as a whole, but there's no one campus that's particularly gigantic. I mean, Baruch has around 20,000 students, and that's larger than most of the CUNY schools. But if you go to a school like Arizona State University, which is in Tempe, which is a suburb of Phoenix, the capital. Arizona State University has 75,000 students on campus. University of Texas has many branches, but the main branch in Austin has 50,000 students on campus. And what schools find is that they're not able to offer enough sections of classes for students to make progress towards their degrees. And so you have students who are forced to hang around for fifth year and sometimes the sixth year just in order to complete their required courses. Excuse me one second. Sorry, just had to close the door to the room I'm recording this in. I had the door open so my dog could come and go, but someone else got on the phone. Anyway, so this progress towards a degree or lack of progress towards a degree is of great concern, and legislators often say to the state education departments or the state universities, we want to put more systems in play, we want to structure the curriculum in such a way that students know what classes they need to take, know which semesters they're going to be able to get those classes and make progress towards a degree. So that's become one of the quantifiable metrics of higher education, and it's something on everybody's or many administrators' minds. Excuse me. I think as students, you well know how this plays out, where I think the English department offers about 90 sections of composition every year, 2100 and 2150. The math department has some courses where they have 50 or 60 sections of the same course. Of course, we don't have that in journalism. I think we've never had more than 3 sections of a course. But every semester, there are students closed out of the courses they need to make progress towards their degree. So why don't the colleges admit everyone to the courses? Because when courses become too large, they become unwieldy, they become harder to teach. It's very hard to do individual learning. Excuse me a second. It's not when I started teaching, but my first full-time job was at NYU, and I taught a course called The History of American Media. And it was a required class, and the enrollment was 280. And we met in an auditorium. And I used to say, it's like being on television. I put on a microphone, I go out on a stage, I tell jokes, and try to hold the audience's attention. You never learn a student's name unless they come to your office to talk to you. And thank goodness they all don't, because, where would you put 280 students in a waiting room? And there aren't enough hours in a week. So you couldn't even take attendance. I mean, it was sort of a joke. They'd say, well, at least once a semester I should take attendance just to see who's here and who isn't. But if you called the roll, that would take the entire class. So you didn't do that either. That sounds extreme, but I know there are at Baruch in some departments classes that are called jumbos and classes that are called super jumbos, and that puts you in the same position. And it also raises the issue of assessment. If you have a really large class like that, you probably have to give exams, and you probably have to give short answer exams, because how are you going to read 280 essays or 280 research papers? So the point I'm trying to make here is there are compromises every step of the way in setting class size and educational policy, and in these issues you can find really good stories to tell. Students who are feeling wronged, faculty who are feeling wronged, students who feel misunderstood or thwarted in what they want to do, and faculty who are in the same situation. So there's, I think of universities, and to some extent